Do you have that one friend who has to hunt down every avocado in sight or add nuts to every snack that they eat? Or maybe it's a friend who tries to avoid fat at all costs. No to butter, oils, mayonnaise, or other creamy spreads and dressings. Well, I have changed the way that I eat over the years based on conflicting research that I've come across in medical journals and from other reputable sources. And it's no secret that dietary fat is still a controversial topic in our culture. Does this sound familiar? Eat butter for optimal health. Or maybe it's this: avoid butter for optimal health. We have seen similar controversial examples in the carbohydrate lecture already. But that really is the nature of this field. And to me, it's really exciting. Our field, as with many sciences, continues to progress and evolve. And it's the latest research that can take your knowledge to the next level. Just imagine if you took a flight across the country. You wouldn't want all of the technology from 50 years ago. You would want the best new technology and advances in the field for a pleasant and safe journey. And so it goes with nutrition and exercise. For example, how much fat should we have in our diet? Should we completely avoid dietary fat, as many people once thought? Or should we make fat a major component of what we eat? Can adding fat to our diets actually improve our body composition, or will eating fat just make us, well, fat? For now, these questions are a bit premature. So let's first talk about what fat really is and what fat actually does for us physiologically. Now, fats have many different roles in our body that go way beyond just how we look. In fact, we need fat for optimal health. Most people think of fat as what is underneath your skin. Here, it is an insulator acting to keep you warm. But fat is also found in your cell membranes, surrounding your internal organs, and in your muscles. It also helps cells to communicate with each other because fats are a major component of cell membranes, cell receptors, and chemical signals in the blood. Certain fats are even used by your body to make other important compounds, including some very important hormones. For example, the cholesterol found in many fatty foods is required to produce your steroid hormones. This is very important for body composition because some of the steroid hormones, like testosterone, can have a big impact on muscle mass and fat mass for men and women. It is often thought that the more fat you eat, the more fat you store on your body. But the truth is that excessive calorie consumption, whether from fat, protein, or carbohydrates, will result in fat storage. The American Council on Exercise classifies the average healthy woman as having about 25 to 31% body fat, and the average healthy man with 18 to 24% body fat. Fit individuals and athletes typically have even lower body fat than this. And of all the functions of fat, its primary role is to provide you with an energy source or an energy reserve that is much greater than any other fuel that you can tap into. For example, if you weigh 180 pounds or 81 kilograms and have 25% body fat, then approximately 45 pounds or 20 kilograms of fat is stored in your body. And because 1 pound of stored fat is thought to provide 3,500 calories, then you essentially have about 160,000 calories of fat to use at any given time. Now, assuming that you can burn about 100 calories per mile while walking, then in theory, you could walk about 1,600 miles on your stored body fat. That would get you from Atlanta to Denver. Of course, there are a number of other factors that would challenge this, but it's important to understand what a large fuel source we have in the form of stored fat. It's far greater than stored carbohydrate that can only provide a theoretical 2,000 calories or slightly more for energy. Fats are actually used for to fuel most of your cells in your body, including contracting muscles in the arms and the legs. Fat provides 80 to 90% of the fuel you use while at rest, like working at a computer all day, driving in your car, or watching TV. Almost 2 to 4% of your body fat serves to protect and insulate vital organs like your heart, your liver, spleen, kidneys, brain, and your spinal cord. And the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K are dependent on fat in your diet for absorption and movement in your body. This is why you should take these vitamins with your meals. In fact, if you have a diet very low in fat, then you can't absorb these key vitamins. This would then impact how well your body can use other nutrients in your diet. And one advantage to fat is that it empties very slowly from your stomach. And due to this fact, eating fatty foods like nuts, seeds, or avocado can also decrease your hunger. In fact, many people report feeling fuller for longer simply having fat included in their meals. So, fats actually have many roles, and because of this, they must be included in a healthy diet. Now, let's dig into what fat actually is, the various types of fat that exist, and when we might be set up to either store fat on our bodies or burn it for energy. Just as carbohydrates are composed of monosaccharides linked together, fats are composed of fatty acids. This is the simplest form of fat, and fat goes by a few names. You may hear about fat as a lipid or even a phospholipid. All of these are considered fats, and in general, they are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, just like carbohydrates. However, the carbon chain in fats is much longer than the carbon chain in carbohydrate. This longer carbon chain is a unique feature of fats and plays a pivotal role in energy production. But I'll get into that in just a few minutes. All fats also contain 9 calories per gram, making them the macronutrient that provides more calories per gram than carbohydrate or protein, which provide only 4 calories per gram. Let's break the forms of fat down a bit. Fatty acids are found in the food you eat, and there are 2 types of fatty acids that you've heard of already. These are saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. These are examples of 2 different types of fats. And fatty acids vary by the length of the carbon-to-carbon chain and the number of hydrogen atoms that surround the carbon chain. That's the definition of saturated or unsaturated. They're either saturated with hydrogens or not. And when fatty acids are joined together, you form a triglyceride. A triglyceride, as the prefix tri tells us, are lipids with 3 fatty acids that are attached to a glycerol backbone. Triglycerides are the major storage form of fat in the body and the major form of fat in your diet. On a food label, you will often see saturated and unsaturated fats highlighted. You may also see monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and trans fats listed. Well, let's define these types of fat a bit more now. Saturated fats are saturated with hydrogens and have no double bonds in the carbon chain. These fats, like animal fats in meat, butter, and coconut oil, are usually solid at room temperature. When saturated fats are the predominant source of fat in the diet, or just eaten in excess, they have been associated with increased blood levels of total cholesterol. And high cholesterol levels have been correlated in some research to increased risk of heart disease. However, not everyone agrees on this. In fact, new research no longer supports the idea that high cholesterol causes heart disease, although correlational data does exist. Some research also shows that excessive intake of saturated fat without balancing it by also eating unsaturated fat is correlated to other serious conditions like Alzheimer's disease, certain cancers, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. But again, new research questions the common recommendation that we need to lower our saturated fat intake from our diets. Some experts now suggest that high saturated fat, in combination with high intake of sugar and other processed carbohydrates, may be the real problem for our health and body composition. In fact, saturated fat may be less of a problem than originally thought, so long as carbohydrate intake is not excessive and balanced fat intake is in place. A balance of fat intake occurs when unsaturated fats are also in your diet. Unsaturated fats contain one or more double bonds along the carbon chain, meaning that unlike saturated fat, they are not completely saturated with hydrogen molecules. There are two types of unsaturated fats, which are called mono and polyunsaturated fats. Monounsaturated fats have only one unsaturated bond. These are called a double bond, while polyunsaturated fats have more than one unsaturated double bond. And an easy way to identify an unsaturated fat is that it is typically liquid at room temperature. But if unsaturated fats are chilled or refrigerated, they will solidify. Examples of monounsaturated fat include olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil, and sesame oil. You also find monounsaturated fats in foods like avocados, peanut butter, and even nuts and seeds. Now, the polyunsaturated fats are also known as essential fatty acids, meaning that they are essential to eat because our bodies cannot make them naturally. Many foods have a mix of fat types, but some examples of polyunsaturated fats include soybean oil, canola oil, flax, tofu, soybeans, and fatty fish like salmon. Now, polyunsaturated fats include both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. These essential fatty acids are needed for immune function, vision, and cell membrane integrity, among other things. Omega-6 fatty acids ultimately produce compounds that are involved with inflammation, blood vessel constriction, and immunity. All of these functions are important, and it's critical that they are well controlled. Because omega-6 fats lead to inflammation when taken at high levels, they are known as pro-inflammatory agents. So eating too many foods with omega-6 fatty acids, like heated vegetable oils and many boxed and packaged grocery items, can compromise health and optimal body composition, especially when not balanced with other types of fats like omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are beneficial for health due to their anti-inflammatory effects and effects on decreasing blood clot formation. Some omega-3 fats keep cells less rigid and more fluid. In doing so, they promote blood vessel dilation, which lowers blood pressure and can decrease instances of heart attacks. Omega-3 fatty acid consumption can also lower blood concentrations of triglycerides, cut the chances of rheumatoid arthritis, and even reduce some behavioral disorders. Some data even show that the omega-3 intake is associated with poor memory and mood disorders. Interestingly, more and more evidence is emerging to support using omega-3 fatty acids in cases of traumatic brain injury to help with immediate and long-term outcomes for these patients. Essentially, omega-3 fatty acids have the opposite role of omega-6 fatty acids. Because of this, you can see that a balanced intake of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids will be needed for optimal health and physical function. Americans tend to have very high omega-6 fatty acids consumption in comparison to omega-3 fatty acids in the diet because of the high content of omega-6s in many of the prepackaged foods and vegetable oils that we eat. In fact, the typical Western diet is reported to be almost 20 to 1 for the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratio, But many experts suggest that the ratio should be more like 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 for optimal health. And this is a real problem because a high ratio is reported to promote things like cardiovascular disease, cancer, and inflammatory and immune diseases. But a higher intake of omega-3 fatty acids seems to have the opposite effect and reduce the likelihood of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and inflammatory disorders. If you can't lower your omega-6 intake, then be sure to reduce the gap in the ratio between eating more omega-3 fatty acids. The balance of the omega-3s in your diet is very important for optimal health. So it's a good idea to attack this from both sides. Decrease the amount of omega-6 fatty acids that you eat and increase the amount of omega-3 fatty acids that you eat. The other type of fat we haven't discussed is trans fat. You may recall that trans fats are often in the media, and legislation in the US to completely ban fats from restaurants has been a big issue. Trans fats are called trans due to the chemical structure of the molecule that surrounds the double bonds between the carbons in the fatty acid chain. Let me explain this. Fatty acids that have a degree of unsaturation will have a double bond between the carbon atoms. This provides a chance for the fatty acids to exist in either a cis form, where hydrogen atoms are on the same side of the carbon chain, or in the trans form, where hydrogen atoms are on opposite sides of the carbon chain. These forms, the cis and the trans, alter the geometric shape of the fat. The transfiguration allows for more stable structure due to the equal distribution of hydrogen molecules on both sides of the double bond. Cis fats with hydrogen atoms on just one side of the carbon atom chain tend to fold upon themselves, while trans fats do not fold up very well. And this makes trans fats able to pack tightly together in the cell membranes and essentially make them rigid. Most naturally occurring fatty acids in foods are in the cis form, and most trans fats are man-made. And trans fats are made in an industrial manufacturing process that adds hydrogen to previously liquid vegetable oil, making it a solid or hard at room temperature. This fat is essentially artificially hydrogenated. This is done to give foods a longer shelf life and may make certain foods taste better. Many restaurants will use partially hydrogenated vegetable oils to deep fry foods because the oil does not need to be changed as frequently as other types of oils. So there is a cost savings for restaurants to consider when they choose the types of oils that they cook with. Many foods contain trans fats, including many baked goods like cookies, fried foods, potato chips, and margarine. A diet high in trans fats may increase your bad LDL cholesterol and decrease your good HDL cholesterol. It may also be associated with your risk of developing heart disease. But some trans fat occurs naturally in food, so it is not entirely avoidable. Now, you may wonder just how much of each type of fat you should eat. Well, opinions vary, but the American Heart Association recommends that for good health, the majority of fats that you eat should be monounsaturated or polyunsaturated rather than saturated fats and trans fats. Others recommend eating about 1/3 of each type of fat: saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fats that include a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. I like to focus on eating high-quality sources of fat like avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, and omega-3 fatty acids from fish and fish oil. Then I just let the rest of my fat take care of itself because it's already in many of the animal products and occasional treats that I have. This has worked well to balance my fat intake to roughly equal parts of mono, poly, and saturated fat intake. So now you understand that there are different types of fats that we can consume and different ways in which we can store fat in the body or use it for energy. And fat is an enormous supply of fuel for us to tap into, And understanding fat use will clearly help to improve body composition. The 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends fat intake to be between 20 and 35% of your total calorie intake, and recommends that saturated fat make up no more than 10% of these calories. They also recommend replacing solid fats with oils when possible, and limiting foods with trans fats or hydrogenated oils as much as possible. The guidelines also recommend eating less than 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol per day. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, one large egg has about 186 milligrams of cholesterol, all of which is found in the yolk. So 2 eggs would put you over the recommended limit. But as we've discussed, this relationship between cholesterol and saturated fat in the diet may not correlate with cholesterol in your blood. Also, many vegetable oils are very high in omega-6 fatty acids, so that could be exactly the wrong recommendation to give to people. So, clearly these fat-related scientific topics continue to be hotly debated as of 2015. No matter how you cut it, fat is the most energy-dense macronutrient that we eat, because 1 gram of fat yields 9 calories. And many people don't need to seek out additional fat to eat when considering total fat eaten per day. That's because fat is usually in many of the foods you eat normally. However, research is now showing that it may be useful to make a real effort to eat more high-quality fats in your diet, like nuts, seeds, avocados, and fish. These foods, as you know, provide a nice variety of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats. And because fat helps you feel full, these foods can be used to help reduce the total amount of calories that you consume in a day. One question that you may have now is, how do I actually burn fat as a fuel? How do I use my stored fat to provide energy and ultimately improve my body composition? Well, as I mentioned earlier, fat provides the most abundant source of energy that we have. It fuels your body at rest and during light to moderate intensity activity. And during this type of exercise, a muscle's main source of fat supply is your fat, or your adipose tissue. Muscles can also rely upon fat that is stored inside of the muscle called intramuscular triglycerides, or IMTG. The amount of intramuscular triglycerides used during exercise or activity will vary with your fitness level. With the more fit you are, the more fat you'll use. This is a great adaptation to exercise, actually. With fat stored in your muscle, it is already located where it needs to be in order to be used as energy. The amount of intramuscular triglycerides will also vary with the intensity and the duration of exercise, where longer and slower activity will rely more upon fat use than short and fast activity. The trick is for your body to get the fat from your fat cells into the blood and then into your muscles in order to be burned or oxidized for energy in the mitochondria of your cells. To do this, fats enter something called the carnitine fatty acid transport system. This system works as a gatekeeper to allow fat into the cell's mitochondria. But fat is not able to enter the mitochondria effectively when levels of glucose are high because another molecule called malonyl-CoA shuts down the carnitine transport system. This means that after a high carbohydrate meal, for example, a muffin, you literally impair the ability to transport fat into your cell's mitochondria to be used as energy. Likewise, some hormone changes occur with high carbohydrate intake that can also work against you being able to burn fat. So just be aware of what you eat and when you eat it. It can impact your body composition and performance dramatically. Anyway, once the free fatty acids released from the stored triglyceride are inside the mitochondria, these fatty acids are broken down to provide energy during a process called beta oxidation, which just means fat is burned as a fuel. What all of this boils down to is that to use fat as a fuel during exercise, your body needs to be able to break down stored triglycerides into free fatty acids to make ATP for energy. The intensity of the exercise will determine if fat will be used during exercise. The more intense the exercise, the less your body will be able to utilize the fat stores and vice versa. As mentioned already, fat oxidation or burning is regulated in part by how much glucose you have in your blood. So eating lots of carbohydrate will increase blood glucose and decrease the breakdown of stored body fat, which is called lipolysis, and fat's use or oxidation for energy. But fat oxidation is enhanced by exercise training. And this occurs because exercise training can increase the number of mitochondria you have, as well as the capillary density. The increase in mitochondria will help the body process the fat at a higher volume, and an increase in capillary density will help increase the blood flow and oxygen delivery to the exercising muscle, which is required to burn fat. Exercise training will also increase the activity of the carnitine fatty acid transport system that essentially allows more fat to enter the increased number of mitochondria that you have from exercising. Interestingly, some supplements may also work through this transport system to help burn fat. We will talk more about this in an upcoming lecture. So, as you probably expected, exercise does help to burn more fat. But of course, it depends on the intensity and the duration of exercise, as well as that overall mix of foods that you have recently eaten. Another interesting aspect of fat burning is the difference we see between men and women. Early studies of sex differences in fuel use during exercise were conducted during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Men and women were asked to run between 65 and 70% of their maximum intensity. And repeatedly, fat use was not shown to be different between men and women when running at a set percent of their maximum. But in follow-up work, another study tracked the number of miles that the men and women ran per week, their years of exercise training, and their relative ability to use oxygen during exercise. And using this advanced design, some differences were found. When the research participants ran at 63% of their maximum on the treadmill for 90 minutes, the women used significantly more fat than men during the exercise, when matched for the different variables of training experience and muscle mass. Also, there weren't significant differences in blood levels of free fatty acids between men and women. This was all despite women having significantly higher blood glucose levels throughout the exercise session. Others looked into 14 untrained and 14 moderately trained and 14 endurance trained men and women before and after cycling at 60% of their maximal oxygen consumption for 90 minutes. The researchers found that in all three training scenarios, only the women were able to significantly utilize the fat stored in their muscle cells. This shows that when compared to men, women are better at using stored fat in their muscles for energy. Also, women were better able to store fat in their muscles than men prior to exercise starting. Recently, it was also reported that fat use relative to body muscle mass was higher in women than in men. This is not entirely surprising because it is well established that on average, women have a significantly higher percentage of the type of muscle fiber that is best used to burn fat as a fuel. These fibers are known as type 1 oxidative muscle fibers. Women have about 68% of their muscle mass composed of type 1 fibers, compared to men at about 55%. And these are the fibers that are used during slower and longer duration activities, the type of exercise that uses a lot of fat during the activity. In general, women also tend to have a greater capillary density, higher percent of type 1 muscle fibers, and a higher fat oxidation than men during low to moderate intensity exercise. So you might ask then, Well, why do men seem to lose weight more quickly if women are actually better at using fat as a fuel? And the answer may be quite complicated, but for simplicity's sake, in my experience, men typically have more room to change, meaning that they tend to start this journey at a higher fat mass than women in general. But let's not go too far yet. All this means is that women and men alike need to exercise to use fat and need to eat in the best possible way to support fat use and optimal health. This is exactly what the rest of this course will cover. Ultimately, fat has many different valuable and necessary physiological roles in the human body. And while fat has been maligned in the nutrition as the bad guy for a long time, there is new evidence indicating that eating fat is likely not all that bad for health or body composition, so long as 1, fat intake is not combined with a high sugar or refined carbohydrate intake, 2, fat is consumed in a more balanced manner between saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat, 3, total caloric intake remains aligned with your nutrition and body composition goals. It is also very clear that exercise of low and moderate intensity help to oxidize or burn fat, but that we also need to increase our overall calorie burn from exercise too. That could occur with either more exercise or by including high-intensity exercise that really gets your blood pumping. You'll learn much more about this topic soon. In the end, there may be small differences in how fat is burned and how much fat is stored between men and women, but I wouldn't get too bogged down by that information. It is far better to stay focused on what you eat and how you choose to incorporate exercise into your life. So try this. Add at least 2 servings of fatty fish to your diet each week, or begin to use a high-quality fish oil supplement.